All right, in the game, here, Gukesh, he opens one f4 in the spirit of the bird's opening, gaining space on the king side, and Magnus, he does not go for the symmetrical idea of f5. Instead, he goes one b6, activating his fianchetto bishop on a8. And of course, with those bishops already on the corners, whenever you move these g or b pawns, those bishops will come slicing down the board immediately, as this bishop is right here. And of course, the pawn on g2 is now pinned, as if it moves, you lose the bishop on h1. Things are already getting serious on move 1. All right, Gukesh, he does the same. b3 is the move, and now Magnus, knight to h6. What is the idea behind two knight h6? Well, it's very simple. Now the queen on the f8 square does defend that bishop on h8, meaning you can go g6, and the bishop will be defended. That pawn on g7 is no longer pinned. All right, Gukesh, he knows that. He goes knight g to f3, getting his knight out into the game, and Magnus does go g6, activating his bishop, and of course now the bishops on a1 and h8 are being attacked. Here Gukesh does trade on h8, bishop takes h8 played in the game, and we have queen takes h8 in response by the GOAT Magnus Carlsen. Now Gukesh, g3 is the move, moving the pawn on the g file, activating his bishop on h1, and of course that bishop is defended, therefore that knight on f3 is not pinned yet. All right, now Magnus in this position, how does he want to proceed? Both sides so far not really fighting for control of the center of the board very well, and here the main options for black include c5 in the spirit of the English opening, the Ben Feingold counterattack with f6, the move f5, knight d6, and queen to g7. In the game, c5 in the spirit of the English was chosen, and now we have the move e3, bolstering the center and potentially setting up the idea of that d4 break. Now here, Magnus finds again the strongest move, knight to c7. It's amazing how even in freestyle chess, he finds the top computer ideas, and the idea behind knight to c7, that knight does support the d5 break, and it may actually want to go to e6 in the middle game. All right, now Gukesh, knight d3 is the move, and of course, both of these knights of Gukesh are eyeing that very important e5 square, and here Magnus does go for the Ben Feingold counterattack with the move f6, clamping down on that e5 square and stopping knight to e5 ideas from white. Of course, there were some other ideas, but this being the strongest one by far, the good old-fashioned Ben Feingold counterattack with the move f6, and just do a YouTube search for Ben Feingold never play f6 if you're not aware of this inside joke. All right, now here, turns out the strongest move for white is the move b4, trying to open up the b file and potentially starting an attack against the black king. Instead of that, in the game, knight to f2 played, and the benefit of this move, you do unblock that pawn on d2, and you do set up that d2 to d4 advance. All right, Magnus, he knows that knight on the rim is very dim. He goes knight to f7, getting it back into the game, and here Gukesh does see space in the center with the move e4, to which Magnus Carlsen probably should castle on the king side with the move short castles. Here's what it looks like. It's very bizarre, short castles. However, instead in the game, he gets a little bit too trigger happy. He goes f5, gaining space on the king side, and he is pressuring that pawn on e4. However, white does have a few different ways to respond, and overall, he is a little bit better positioned for the opening up of the center of the board. Now here, the strongest responses for white include d4 and rook to e1, again capitalizing on the opening up of the center of the board. Instead, queen to e2 played with a similar idea of supporting the pawn on e4. That way black takes with the pawn, you take back with the knight, and the bishop cannot take it. I mean, it can, but you wouldn't want to give up that light squared bishop on the long diagonal, and then the knight recaptures, or the queen recaptures, and you are just fine. However, here, Magnus Carlsen, capitalizing on the weakness of this move queen to e2, he finds the strongest response, e5, and now we have the famous pawn square in the center of the board here. All of these pawns are attacking every other pawn, and how does Gukesh want to respond? Well, he has literally 4 different good options here. F takes e5, e takes f5, knight to g5, and finally knight takes e5. In the game, he does go f takes e5, recapturing towards the center. Very hard to argue with that move. Now we have some trades. Knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and then queen takes e5, the queen of the GOAT Magnus Carlsen finally getting into play in the center of the board. And now here, white makes a very, very dubious, maybe even downright bad move. He does does castle short. So the king swings over to the king side. Short castles is the move, and this turns out to be a massive mistake. And again, if you are confused by this move, in freestyle chess, when you castle, the king and the rook always go to their typical squares regardless of where they start. So the king slides all the way over to g1, the rook to f1, just as in a normal game of chess, even though it looks kind of weird. So short castles is the move. And the problem with this, here black can simply open up the center with a very strong move d5, and white would rapidly be in a lot of trouble as his king on g1 would be extremely vulnerable. Even in freestyle chess, king safety is of the utmost importance, and that is what happens here. So d5 played in the game, the very strong break in the center, and now, of course, the pawn on e4 is pinned. If you take on d5, e takes d5 would be a huge blunder, as then you literally hang the queen on the spot on the e2 square. You simply cannot let that happen. So instead of that, here Gukesh does go d4, fighting back in the center of the board. That is the right idea. And here already, Magnus Carlsen, despite having a very large advantage, a very large initiative, he makes a massive mistake. Here, he actually goes queen takes d4, gobbling up that free pawn with the queen, but it turns out you should not be doing this. The queen is just way too vulnerable on that d4 square. Instead, the move queen to e8 is the right response, retreating with the queen. Instead, queen takes d4 played in the game, and now the advantage does swing back to Gukesh, and the deep calculating player Gukesh, he finds the right response. That is simply e takes g5, trading a pair of pawns, black takes back, and then you go rook b to d1, lining up the rook with the queen, and now both the queen and the pawn on d5 are already getting very vulnerable, and Gukesh is starting to fight back in the game, and already black's advantage has all but disappeared. Of course, that queen must move now. Where is it going to go? In the game, queen g7 chosen, a decent square for the queen. And now here, Gukesh has many different options. According to the engine, moves like knight to h3, bishop to g2, a2 to a4, queen to d3, and finally, queen to h5 are all playable. In the game, knight to h3 chosen, a good square for the knight. The knight does guard that f4 square. That would be a perfect blockading square. And beyond that, the rook is pressuring f5. The scope of the rook is opened up. Now here, black goes rook to f8. Good move by Carlsen, guarding that f5 pawn with the rook. Now we have c4. Gaining space on the queen side is the world champion Gukesh. And now here, Magnus Carlsen, he castles long, castles on the queen side, but of course his king does not move at all. Long castles is the move. The rook simply slides over to the other side of the king, as the king was already on c1. And the idea behind that move, the rook is now activated on the other side of the king, a decent move, and it turns out the strongest move according to the engine. Now we have knight to f4. Of course, that pawn on f5 was defended, so the next best thing is bringing that knight into the game. Now here, black goes rook d to e8, lining up the rook with the white queen on the e2 square. Where is the... Oh, excuse me. Sorry, instead of rook d to e8, that is the strongest move. Instead, rook f to e8 played here. And again, rook d to e8 was a little bit stronger, lining up the d rook with the queen. Now, the problem with the other move played in the game, rook f to e8, is here, white can pile up pressure on that pawn on f5. The strongest way to do so is queen to h5, but queen d3, as chosen in the game, is also decent, pressuring that very weak f5 pawn. And of course, the rook on f1 may be pressuring it in the very near future as well. Now, what is black going to do about it? Well, he goes d4, trying to relieve some of the tension in the position. And of course, now the bishops on the long diagonal are both attacking each other. They are both defended. Neither side will be losing a bishop. However, again, white's going to have a lot of pressure on that pawn on f5. And here, Gukesh, he finds the very simple tactical idea. You take the bishop, black takes back with the knight, and then the pawn on f5 is hanging, and you capture it with check. Queen takes f5, wins the free pawn, hits the king on c8, and Gukesh now has a commanding lead in this position. All right, queen d7 chosen in the game, trying to offer the queen trade, and here Gukesh, turns out he can keep the queens on the board if he wants to. There is simply no need to go for the queen trade. For example, queen to h5, queen g5, and queen d3 are all excellent moves, but in the game, he does go for the endgame. Queen takes d7, chosen by Gukesh. The queens come off the board. Then we have rook takes d7, and then finally knight d5, jumping in with the knight. Now here in the endgame, material is even, but very importantly, white has that outside pawn majority. He will be able to make a pass pawn on the king side here, and of course that pawn on d4 is a pass pawn, but it is relatively easy to blockade. The engine says the game here is pretty equal, but overall, I think white is going to have the better practical chances from here. All right, in the game, Magnus Carlsen, rook g7 is the move, lining up the rook with the g-pawn, stopping h2 to h4 ideas. In response, rook d to e1 by Gukesh, lining up pressure against the rook on the e8 square. Now we have some trades. Rook takes e1, then rook takes e1, and then knight to c7, jumping in with that knight. The knight no longer on the very edge of the board, the very corner of the board. Now we have knight f4. Gukesh keeping those knights alive. Of course, his knight on f4 is better placed than the black knight on c7, and this knight also plays a very important role in terms of blockading that pawn on the d4 square, blockading d3 if necessary. So it's very, very important for white to keep those knights on the board for now. All right, in the game, king d7, chosen by the GOAT, the greatest endgame player of all time. He knows the king belongs in the center of the board. Then we have rook to e5, jumping up with the rook, perhaps eyeing that h5 square, and it turns out, yes, that is what happens. Magnus goes rook to e7, and Gukesh rook to h5, keeping his rook as active as possible. Now we have knight to e8 for Magnus, the idea being now the knight has access to both d6 and the f6 squares. Now rook to h6, jumps up with the rook, and then finally knight d6 for Magnus. Now we have knight d5 jumping up and pressuring the rook on the e7 square. Then rook to f7 slides the rook over, and then knight f6 jumps in with the knight and pressures the king on d7. Then we have king to d8, knight d5 once again, and then knight to f5. Magnus opting not to repeat moves. If he wanted to, he could go king d7, then knight f5, king d8, knight d5, and knight d5, and so on, and that would be a draw by repetition. However, Magnus, the GOAT, going knight to f5, breaking the repetition here and showing he is truly playing for a win in this position. All right, the rook on h6 under attack. We have rook to e6 defending, and then king to d7, pressuring the rook on the e6 square. Now we have rook to e2 for Gukesh, dropping back with the rook, and king d6, and slowly but surely, it does seem like Magnus is starting to fight back in this game. He's centralizing his king. His rook and his knight are a little bit better placed than they were before. Keep in mind, the knight used to be all the way on the a8 square, and Magnus is slowly but surely pressing here. All right, Gukesh, rook to f2, opposing the rook on f7. Now that knight on f5 is pinned to the rook. Then we have b5. Magnus gaining space on the queen side. Then we have king to f1, sliding the king over. Then the b pawns come off the board. B takes, and king to e5. And again, Magnus slowly but surely marching his king down the board. He is certainly playing for a win here. All right, Gukesh, he's down but not out. King to e1. He slides his king over. The king now has access to d2 and d3. That'd be a very good blockading square. Now we have knight to d6, dropping back with the knight, then knight to f4, and then rook to c7. Magnus biding his time in this position. Now here, the best way for Gukesh to fight back is to force that king back a square simply with the move knight d3. You force back the king, for example, king to e6, then rook e2, it's the king once again, and you can always defend on c2 later or somewhere else with the knight to defend that c4 pawn. Instead here, rook e2 played immediately, and this move is quite a bit more challenging to play. Black goes king to f5. His king is perfectly fine there, and here in this position, Gukesh makes the fatal mistake of the endgame. He plays the move knight d5, and this looks very logical. After all, you jump up with the knight, pressure the rook with a gain of tempo. What is the problem with this move? Well, it's very simple. Black here simply goes rook to b7, intending rook b1. That rook is going to be an absolute monster real fast. Instead of knight d5, the right move here was simply rook to f2, again intending knight d3. That is the right way forward, and if black takes on c4 in the meantime, time, then you can go knight to d5, hitting the king with check from the rook and winning the other rook on c7. Again, though, instead, knight d5 played in the game, followed by rook b7, and here Magnus is starting to take over. Now here the key idea for Gukesh to hang on is knight to e7, jumping in with the knight and pressuring the king, but he makes yet another mistake here. h3, trying to guard that g4 square, trying to block off any entrance point for that king on f5, but here Magnus finds the key idea, knight to e4, jumping in with the knight and blockading the rook on the e-file, therefore giving the king access to go to e4, perhaps followed by d3 and king to d4. That is the right way forward. Here Gukesh, g4 hits the king, but it is too little, too late. King to e5, centralizes the king. Then we have king to f1. The king slides over, then d3, pressures that rook on the e2 square, then rook to e1, and finally, the last move of the game, king to d4. And here in this position, Gukesh D, he simply resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. There is nothing he can do to stop the onslaught of the rook, the king, the knight, and of course, the very important pass pawn. Black's going to go, for example, d2, perhaps rook b2, perhaps rook b1 in the near future, and there's very, very little white can do to stop that pass pawn. So for that reason, he resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Gukesh D, the reigning world champion, and Magnus Carlsen, the former world champion, in day number 2 of the 2025 Freestyle Chess Grand Slam tournament.